outcomes of health, education, and labor force participation. Considering financial inclusion and empowerment, we have studied how financial inclusion of women has profound impact for society as a whole. Presently, our team is studying property rights and the impact it has on gender inequality in a society. Taking this forward, today's event is on women's political participation and development by Dr. Sonia Bhalotra. Dr. Sonia Bhalotra is a professor of economics at the University of Essex. Her research has contributed to improved understanding of the creation of human capital. Her research uses cross-country data from developing countries and historical data from developed nations to address contemporary policy problems in India and other relatively poor countries. Her areas of focus are child development, global health, gender and family economics, political economy, and intergenerational mobility. Our discussants for the day are Atishi, who is a leader of Aam Aadmi Party and a member of the party's Political Affairs Committee. She has played a pivotal role in revamping the state of education in government-run schools in Delhi. Having been involved with the AAP since its inception, she has committedly worked towards the welfare of society with special attention to education systems. She'll be with us shortly. Our other discussant of the day is Dr. Mudit Kapoor, who's an assistant professor of economics at Indian Statistical Institute. He has undertaken extensive research on the topics of development economics, including health and financial inclusion, gender and political economy. Today's session will be moderated by Dr. Shamika Ravi, who is the Director of Research at Brookings India and a Senior Fellow of Governance Studies program at Brookings India and Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. She's also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Without further ado, I now invite Professor Bhalotra to begin her presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. And I've been told I have 40 minutes to talk and then there'll be discussion later. But if you have a really pressing question, do feel free to interrupt me. Okay. So I'm going to try and present what are two academic papers in this time. The first is located in India and it's about women legislators and economic performance. And it's joint work with, you see, Bhaskaran, Brian, and Yogesh. And the second paper is going to take global data on quotas for women and look at maternal mortality as an outcome. Is the voice okay, Shamika? Okay. Okay, so I will proceed. These are pictures of women in India. So there's been substantial underrepresentation of women in politics. Today, worldwide, the share of women in parliaments is 23%. In the UK, it's just recently risen to 32%, and in India, it's at about 10%. However, there's been a phenomenal increase, so there's been a doubling of the share of women, both in India and globally, in about the last 20 years. So it's important to look at what this rising trend means substantively. I'm starting with a picture just to show you that the distribution of female legislators in India in this period is quite even, because often when I talk about this paper, people think, oh, are they all in the northwest or are they all in Kerala? So you can see here that they're fairly widespread. We know already from previous research that the gender of legislators influences the composition of public spending. What we don't know is how economic activity, the rising tide that's thought to lift all boats, responds to having women. But there is this lurking suspicion that women are good for women or women are good for children, and it's possibly the case that women are bad for economic growth because they tend to be left-leaning, they tend to want to impose taxes to increase social spending, for example, on education and health. So this creates the sense that women may be bad for fairly short-term growth. So what we really want to test in this paper is whether women are good for economic growth, because that would just change the whole packet. And if they're good for growth, then they can, using the growth dividend, spend more on health or the promotion of education or whatever. So although I believe there's no causal evidence before this on the impact of women on economic performance in general, there is some recent evidence of women on corporate boards, and of course corporations are interested in economic performance. The results of this work are mixed, and basically it seems that if you adjust for selection, in a German study, the first one, there's no impact, and the implementation of quotas for women in Norway led to worsening firm performance, but this was, the authors were able to tie this to women being less experienced, so it's a sort of short-term bump. Our approach, which I'll now quickly describe, avoids the issues imposed by quotas of candidate selection and potential quality distortion. So, does it move anymore? Okay. Sorry, here I am. So we're going to look at elections to India's state legislative assemblies, so at MLAs, over the period from 92 to 2012, which was 4 elections. And one reason nobody has looked at whether women or men are better for economic performance is that it's hard to measure economic performance at the constituency level. So to address this challenge, we use luminosity data. There's a history, there's some previous research showing that changes in nightlight density are a proxy for economic activity. So this is potentially controversial. I'm not going to discuss it at length because the reference there to Henderson discusses all the issues of measurement, interpretation, and so on. The only thing I'd say is that there's also a whole body of relatively new research showing how very poorly GDP is measured in developing countries. So I would say night lights have many deficiencies, but so does GDP, and it's actually not clear which is better. They're both different, imperfect measures of economic performance. So this shows you a map of the data we're going to use on luminosity in the year 92. And all I want to show you is you can see growth, because in 2009, there's just much more light. Sorry, I'm not clicking very well. So that's 92, and that's 2009. So India's grown. And this is a closer look at the luminosity data at the constituency level. So So this picture is trying to show you the link. On the y-axis, the vertical, is the log of GDP, and on the x-axis is the night luminosity for the same state. So these are state, every cell is a state year, and it shows you a strong positive association between GDP and luminosity at the state level. So if we were working at the state level, we could just use GDP. But because we want to work at the constituency level, and we can map the light data into any level of aggregation, we've mapped satellite images of luminosity to the constituency level over time. So we can look at the growth in luminosity and call it, or use it as a proxy for the growth in the economy. So, there's a lot of research on this, so I wouldn't push it too hard. I only have to say what I said before, which is GDP is a very poor measure. Night lights also have imperfections, and they're highly correlated. Yeah. Okay, so I won't detail the empirical strategy because it's a general audience and I want to cover quite a few things. I just want you to know that the main challenge for the analytical strategy is that where women are elected, they may be elected because the voters are more progressive. So when women do whatever they do, make policy choices, they may be making those policy choices in response to the local preferences of their constituents. And we don't want to pick up voter preferences. We want to pick up the preferences of the politician. So in order to shut down or close off the pathway of voter preferences, we use what's called a regression discontinuity design, in which we restrict the sample to constituencies in which women won against men or lost against men, but in which women and men won and lost against each other by a very narrow margin, so narrow that it can be deemed idiosyncratic. In this way, the preferences of voters in the constituencies in which a woman just lost are likely to be matched to the preferences of voters in constituencies in which they just won. So there are not many references on the slides, but there are accompanying papers which Brookings can send you. And the first proof of this RD design for close elections was in Lee 2008. So after using this design to isolate the preferences of the legislator from the preferences of the voter, we then analyze mechanisms. And just to presage the results, we find that women are less corrupt. And we find this using two completely independent measures, which increases the force of the finding. One is data on criminal records of candidates standing for election, so it's before office, and the other is information on behavior in office, which is called rent seeking. So we measure corruption in two different ways, and with both measures we find women are less corrupt. We then look at whether women are better at completing road building projects under PMGSY, and we find they are. And then we do what I admit is a fairly crude test of strategic versus intrinsic motivation, which is whether politicians act because they care, that would be intrinsic, or they act because they want to be re-elected, and that would be strategic. So I won't do this. These are our main results. And basically what varies across columns, I won't detail, but is robustness to different bandwidths for the close election window. The bandwidth is the victory margin. So because I'm not explaining technical details, I would encourage students or colleagues who have questions about the techniques to talk to me after or in discussion time. But basically the significant coefficient in the row called female MLA tells you that luminosity growth at the constituency level is higher under women legislators who just win against men than under male legislators who just win against women. These are checks on the design. This is a picture of the result. So now what we found is that women-led constituencies grow faster. But is it possibly a zero-sum game, or could it even be negative in the aggregate? So could it be that female politicians are drawing state resources away from male-led constituencies and into female constituencies, in which case net growth may not benefit? So we did this test where we used maps again, and using the map we found all the neighboring constituencies of every female constituency in the country, and we took the average light growth in the neighbors and regressed that on whether the index constituency was led by a woman. And we find no negative spillovers. In fact, the coefficient is positive but imprecise. So again, a discussion of why spillovers may exist or be negative or positive is in the paper, and I don't have time to discuss it. But this result tells us that women not only increase growth in their constituencies, but overall, because there's no cancelling out of it in male constituencies. Then we looked at mechanisms. So I'm not sure when I started. Okay. Um, so we looked at these, I don't know how many of you know the sorts of data we have in India, but when candidates stand for election, they have to file an affidavit where they declare their pending criminal records, their wealth, education, age, and so on. And looking just at these raw data, so there's no processing of the data, we find that 10% of elected women legislators have a pending criminal record when they contest, compared with 32% of men. This large gap in criminal behavior is consistent with innate traits. The reason I say this is you might think it's because women are inexperienced and they haven't really learned the ropes yet. So once there are enough of them and they've been around long enough, they'll be just as corrupt as men. I can't rule that out. It may still be the case, but working against that view is that there's increasing experimental evidence that women are less risk-taking, more patient, more fair, and all of these tendencies are correlated with aversion to criminal behavior. And if you look at the statistics on criminal behavior in general, it's predominantly male. And if we do some back-of-the-envelope calculations with our estimates, we can attribute 1/4 of the performance gap between men and women just to this measure of criminality. But there is some economic theory and political science theory as well, suggesting that once elected, politicians may be ennobled. They might start feeling a moral duty to serve the people. Alternatively, they might be, once elected, conscious of the need to be re-elected. For either reason, they might behave better after they're in office. So we followed a recent Journal of Political Economy paper by Ray Fisman, which is set in India. That paper is all about measuring corruption in office in India. The difference is they don't discuss men and women. So they take all politicians and they measure rent-seeking. So we follow their exact strategy, but we distinguish men and women. And we find that women are 10 percentage points per annum less likely to accumulate wealth while in office, which is the measure of rent-seeking. Then we wanted to see, so it seems fairly plausible to most people that women are less corrupt. But we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to see if their corruption was everything, or whether they were also just good at doing the things politicians usually do, like build roads or other infrastructure. We chose the PMGSY because it's federally funded, but the local politician needs to bid for the road contracts, and they go to the village level. So there's this tie with the constituency level that we need for bringing it back to our analysis of growth. We found that there was no difference in the number of contracts that men or women legislators won. So that's also an interesting result. Women didn't negotiate fewer contracts, they were equal. Conditional on the number of contracts that women won for their regions, the share of incomplete road projects was 22 percentage points lower when the constituency was led by a woman. So we interpret this as women just being more effective at building infrastructure. Now it could be that a reason that they are more effective is that they're less corrupt again, because incompleteness in infrastructure projects often is because of leakage of federal funds to the construction people. So it could be that corruption is at the bottom of this, but we don't know. It also could just be that they are better at monitoring or they care more to complete. Why this is important is that there is this vast literature now on political identity. And in this literature, what is becoming a stylized fact is that women are good at serving the interests of women and children. And we know that, but actually the returns to road construction are higher for men. So this is a bit of a breakthrough in showing that women also do the usual things, like build roads, even though the returns there are not targeted at women. And finally, as indicated before, politicians can be opportunistic, i.e. looking to re-elect themselves, or they can be motivated by a larger cause. It seems plausible that opportunism or electoral incentives are sharper in swing constituencies, where basically the seat is not safe. So we divided our sample of constituencies into those that were strictly or tightly contested in the last, we varied it, last election or last 3 elections, and found that this difference in male and female performance that favored female legislators was only significant in non-swing constituencies. So this means that when the election constraint is tight, then men behave well. But when they know they can relax, then they relax. Whereas women sort of never relax in that speak. So the conclusions are that women raise economic performance both in their own constituency and overall. And this is not because of selection, which is what we try to eliminate with this close selection design. The mechanisms that we find some support for include that women are less corrupt, they're more intrinsically motivated, and they have efficacy for whatever reason in completion of infrastructure projects. Looking forward to whether these results generalize, whether they'll get better or worse with economic development and so on. I have many other speculations I could share with you in discussion time, but I thought the most interesting thing to point out was that in developing countries, including India, there are still lots of opportunities for corruption. And so politicians who are less corrupt, like women, may have an advantage in achieving growth. However, as development proceeds and opportunities for corruption get smaller, the advantage of women in that particular regard will tend to erode. So we may think that with development, the male-female gap that we found could dissipate. Alternatively, you could think that there will always be opportunities for corruption, even in European countries, or women will always be more efficacious, so it may not erode. I think that's the only interesting thing I'll say now. And this is just world data. This is, I think, all available countries, 179 or something countries. If you in one picture on the right is in levels, and the first is in changes. So if you take either levels of or changes in the share of women in parliament and relate these to GDP or GDP growth, you see no relation. If you do this for India, which is using ordinary least squares on our data, you also see nothing. And that is just to say that one should not be misled by the correlation being essentially 0, because there is massive selection, which basically means that where and when women rather than men are elected is not random. But if you could adjust for that, so you isolate what it is that women do upon the baseline that they enter, then you find these large positive effects. These are all statistical tests. Okay, I finished with this one. So I don't know what my total time is now for the next paper.
You have another 16 minutes.
60. Okay, there's another paper. And then there's some wrap-up. But while it's being loaded, you could ask me questions if you want. Or shall I just go on? Okay. Am I loud enough at the back? Okay. So this paper is related clearly because it's about how women perform relative to men. But it's different in strategy, design, and scope. So now, instead of looking at India, we're looking at all countries for which data are available, so the world. And we're looking not at competitive elections, but at gender quotas. So I'll explain. We focus on maternal mortality, which you can see is high and concentrated in low-income countries. In fact, maternal mortality rates in sub-Saharan Africa today exceed the rates a century ago in richer countries, and that's despite all the know-how and technology and so on being available now and not then. There was a Millennium Development Goal target for maternal mortality, which was not met. It was sort of left halfway. You can see the figures there. But the Sustainable Development Goal target is more ambitious. So we clearly need an innovation, because maternal mortality did fall, actually for the first time, and quite impressively, but well below target. And there's still lots of room for maneuver. So this paper is about proposing a policy innovation. So the fact that maternal mortality is concentrated, sorry, I keep going the wrong way, is concentrated in poor countries might lead you to think that income growth will bring maternal mortality down. The picture on the left shows you that female life expectancy, which is correlated with maternal mortality, does increase with income growth. However, the difference between female and male life expectancy in the right-hand picture does not. So the gap between men and women is not varying with income growth. So our hypothesis is that this large variation in maternal mortality across countries that remains conditional on income is not because of the costs being unaffordably high, nor because the technology is lacking, but because MMR has been a low policy priority. And so our hypothesis is that raising the share of women in government will change this. And we're going to say at more or less no cost. So the cost argument is something you can push me on, but we're going to argue that you can bring MMR down in a sense at no cost by effectively replacing men with women in government. So we propose a new policy tool for MMR, which is gender quotas. MMR has been difficult to bring down, and gender quotas are not on the agenda, not in the public health discussion. And also, on the other side, people interested not in MMR but in quotas have been looking at quotas. The evidence is mixed, but actually nobody has analyzed this particular wave of gender quotas that started in 1995 effectively and swept through 21 developing countries. This wave, we don't know any other analysis of. So this is just a really simple picture of the two main stylized facts. Looking forward from 1990, you see an impressive increase in the share of women in parliament, which is the blue line, and you see a consistent decline in MMR, which is the red line. And you see the figures on the slides, and our paper asks if these two impressive trends might be causally related. Now, the problem with isolating causal effects of women in parliament is that this rise has been fairly smooth. And whenever anything is smooth, it could be confounded with or mixed up with other slowly changing things, including attitudes, which we don't comprehensively measure, or income, or who knows, climate, could be anything. So it's hard to isolate causal effects of the share of women in parliament. To do this, we're going to exploit the abrupt legislation of quotas, sweeping through LICs, low-income countries. Abrupt is key. There's a date, there's no quota, and the next moment there's a quota. And that abruptness should not coincide with a sharp change in other stuff, such as attitudes. There's no reason that attitudes would change the day the quota is implemented. So there was a wave of gender quotas since the Beijing 1995 conference, and this is what we use. So for the economists in the room, I won't read this, I'll just say we use an event study design, and maybe a picture is better. So the design involves, so this is not raw data, this is processed data. So this picture shows you the causal estimate, we say, the causal estimate of imposing a gender quota of any size. I'll discuss sizes later. The causal effect of imposing a gender quota on on the share of women in parliament. So this is what I call the compliance graph, or economists call the first stage. So the quota worked. Just to explain what an event study is, you draw a vertical line, the bold black vertical line in the middle at -1, which represents the date of the quota in a particular country, but this date varies across countries. So if one country implemented it in 1998 and another in 2004, for both the 98 and the 2004 will be coded as -1 for that particular country. So the black line is the date of the event, and that date varies. But for each country in the sample, we see what's happening to the outcome measured on the y-axis before the event and after the event. So in this picture you see, before the dark black vertical line, that there is no change in the share of women in parliament. Then the event happens, which is a quota, and there's a jump in the share of women in parliament. And those cloudy bits are confidence intervals, so the jump is significant. There's lots of detail I'm not discussing, so the jump is 5 percentage points or 55%, and we have a very long paper with country-specific graphs and changes by quota size and so on, which I can't go into here. So this is the key slide in the paper. This is what you really want to take home or put in the blog or whatever. This is showing you that following the event of a quota, which is the vertical black line again, there's a sharp fall in maternal mortality, and there's no evidence that it was beginning to fall before the quota. So So lots
We'll
of
get to that. We'll get to that. Yeah. Let's wait for the presentation to end, and then we'll talk about the other stuff.
But actually you're right, what I haven't explained is we control for a lot of factors. So this is not the raw data. This is conditional on country and year fixed effects, country-specific trends, and because they're endogenous controls, only in a variation, there are also, in fact this variation includes them. There are controls for GDP, health expenditure, and whether the country is democratic. Okay. So these are the equivalent regression tables behind those graphs. And now this is showing you some variations. The impact of gender quotas on maternal mortality is bigger, the bigger the quota, which is a sort of coherence test on the design, but is also interesting because it's not absolutely clear, because there are cases. There's a recently published paper in the EJ this year looking at the first introduction of women on juries in Britain, and one woman made a difference. And also in my work with Irma Klotz, where we show that Indian women are better for health in general, not maternal mortality, but general health. Often the change that's happening in the Indian data is exactly one woman in the district. So at least these two papers show that one woman in a large assembly can make a difference. So it wasn't obvious whether it's an extensive margin change or the numbers of women matter, and it seems the numbers do matter. And then this result shows you for 3 samples divided up as having low, medium or high baseline rates of MMR. And basically, as you might expect, because of the low hanging fruit argument, women are most effective in bringing MMR down where it's initially higher. Just to put the effect sizes in perspective, the average decline in MMR in the sample that's averaged over the sample window is 10%. If we wanted to achieve a 10% decline in MMR using only income increases, if we could engineer that, we would need to increase GDP by 20%, which is not going to happen. So it's actually more effective than income increasing women. The rest I think I've said. Okay, these are tests on the strategy, which I don't know, Shamika, should I go through? But basically, one of the things people assessing the work as economists worry about is that the implementation of quotas wasn't random. So we don't argue the implementation is random, we argue the timing of the implementation is quasi-random, and we test it. But one of the things people still worry about is that there are predictors of quotas. So we found a recent Oxford University Press book written by a quite well-known political scientist, which is all about what leads to gender quotas. It's all about the determination. So it's all in English, not numbers. So we found all the things she discusses and tried to measure them in WDI data and put them on the right-hand side. And they included things like having peacekeeping forces or having recently transitioned to democracy. So there seems to be some sort of foreign pressure to implement quotas, but this is orthogonal to our results. Then we did a number of robustness checks, which are motivated by some econometric issues. We removed all high-income countries, which were just acting as controls. We estimated the event studies with balanced samples so that we don't have possibly compositional effects in the results. We used maternal mortality in levels rather than logs, and we allowed for the fact that there was some clustering of the actual quota implementation. We checked if India and China, being very big, are dominating the results. Similar to that, we weighted by population. In case they were endogenous, we took out all time varying controls. And importantly, we conditioned on health expenditure. The last is important to people in the policy world. So women were bringing maternal mortality down conditional on health expenditure. And this is why we say it's pretty low cost. It's really allocative efficiency or reprioritization. So the data we used were published by a multi-agency UN task force, and there's some prediction within the data which creates uncertainty in the estimates. So we did some Bayesian work, bootstrapping confidence intervals in different ways to account for that, which I don't show right now. But we also just used the DHS, and we could replicate the main results. This is that Bayesian procedure, which I won't discuss. More robustness. Sorry, what I want to do is mechanisms. Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not understanding the clicker, sorry. Okay, 2 minutes is fine. So what is it that women do? This is what I wanted. So this is not rocket science. The WHO has been recommending for maternal mortality, trained birth assistance, prenatal care, and lower fertility, especially of teenagers. In their recommendations, they don't consider the political economy of delivering this. So we test whether what women do is just implement known things. They just do it rather than we already know, we don't need more money, we just have to do it. And this is our hypothesis, and this is what we find. So there are event studies for all these outcomes, but to summarize, as soon as gender quotas are passed, you see a structural break, a significant change in skilled birth attendance and prenatal care utilization. You also see a decline in birth rates and an increase in girls' education, but you see no increase in resources. So imposing quotas, unlike in my first paper, women's quotas don't increase GDP growth. They don't increase health expenditure, and they don't increase development assistance for health. These are results for those outcomes. So this is the conclusion. Women policy makers just seem more effective at targeting women's health. We saw no change in total resources, so it could be allocative efficiency, or we may be concerned that it's substitution. Maybe women are bringing down maternal mortality, but men are dying of cancer or TB. So we looked at male mortality in the reproductive years, which is the analog of female MMR, and we found basically no impact. It's just invariant to gender quotas. We also looked at TB because it's gender neutral and is very prevalent. And finally, we looked at infant mortality, where we see some tendency for bigger declines for girls than for boys, consistent with the main idea that women target female health. And I'll just show you 2 slides on this and I'll stop. So in the same paper, we have a subsection, or had a subsection, we took it out recently, where we asked, so we're looking at the first ever significant decline in maternal mortality in developing countries, at least as far as it's been recorded, because we didn't have data before, since 1990. So it's a new data set, it's a new phenomenon. But there was history when MMR was just as high as it is in developing countries, and it was brought down. And our question was, did women have anything to do with MMR decline in history? But when MMR declined, say in the United States, between 1910 and 1930, it was, sorry, I said the wrong thing. It declined from 1937. What happened between 1910 and 1930 was across the states of the United States, there was a award of women's suffrage. So women were given the vote, and that was staggered across the states. So there's a paper by Grant Miller in economics, which looks at this staggered introduction of women's suffrage or vote, and shows that it led to increased health expenditures and lower infant mortality. So we take that data on suffrage and we interact it with the arrival of the first antibiotics called sulfonamides that facilitated the decline of maternal mortality. So maternal mortality couldn't react just to suffrage because there was no medical knowledge. So we used the 1937 arrival of this medical tool, the drug, which addressed puerperal sepsis, which is an infection after birth, and interacted with suffrage. And we see that in states that had suffrage for a longer duration or that had it earlier, declines in MMR in the same year were larger. And I will show you literally 2 slides. Here are some nice pictures of the suffrage movement. And this is what I said about the state variation in suffrage. And that the first significant decline was with these sulfonamide antibiotics in 1937. What nobody has looked at before is how vast the variation in decline was across the states, varying from 6% to 80%. And this decline seems to be explained partly by women having suffrage earlier. So just looking at the bullet points at the end to conclude, the previous paper on India suggests that women certainly don't harm GDP, even if they don't increase it. So the cost of gender quotas may be low in that sense. Often we think of policies like having immunization coverage, and it takes resources and time to bring that up to scale. but women in parliament are already at scale, and this policy addresses two sustainable goals at once, the gender equality goal and the maternal mortality goal. Maternal mortality is still high, women's parliamentary share is still low, and so there's potential for the two to kind of cooperate for further improvement. Okay, thanks.
I now request Atishi to come on the stage and take this discussion forward. Yeah.
Do it whichever way you want.
We could all come on the stage. Ah, okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, after hearing Sonia's paper, I'm not sure I'm equipped to speak after her. And the reason being that I think there's two ways one can look at this question. I think that one is, of course, the empirical data that we have seen in terms of what kind of policy impact there is. But somewhere there is another question at the base of it that we are looking to address. That when we are looking at what kind of impact women's participation in politics has on maternal mortality, our base question that we are looking to address is that we know that there is a very clear gender disparity on all socioeconomic indicators. And as I said, since I'm not very well equipped to speak after her, unlike Sonia, I had to sort of Google some statistics on the way to Brookings over here. And so, of course, as we know, all statistics are extremely skewed. And as my Googled information tells me, they're even more skewed than I had actually expected. And just in terms of the fact that some of the data showed that almost 80% of women in India actually need permission from their family to visit a primary health care center. And the fact that you have 36% women who are anemic, they were just one after the other data, far fewer women are literate, etc. So we know the fact that there is, on all socio-economic data, there is a huge gender disparity. And somewhere we are looking at this question of really, can women's participation in politics actually change that? That is a larger question that we are looking at. And I requested Shamika for a copy of the document on this gender secretariat at Brookings. And I think that one of the purpose of this center as well is that we can have more gender responsive governance. So I think what is it that's going to give us this gender responsive governance is what we have to look at, because I mean, it does raise the question that if women, 80% women need the permission of their families to visit a primary healthcare center, how effective are we going to be at ensuring women's participation in politics? How effective are we then going to be at having them be in decision-making positions after that? And to be able to overcome whatever power structures exist within those parties, within those governments, etc., to have an effective impact on policy. And the fact is that these power structures exist, and we all know it. So I think that for this entire question of addressing what is going to bring about a gender-sensitive form of governance, I think it was interesting the terms that you had used. I think it's a very interesting distinction between what you had called intrinsic motivation and strategic motivation. And I think that this is really something that can give us an insight into what can be a lever of change. Is that I do not think personally, and I think that I'm coming from an experience in politics rather than much study of it, I don't necessarily think that we can rely on this idea of intrinsic motivation. I think that while it is a desirable, I think that we have to realize that that is not what moves the system. We have to understand what are the levers that are actually affecting these power structures. And finally, it is strategic motivation within politicians to get re-elected once again, that really governs our democratic structures, that governs our governance structures, that governs why some systems work and some systems don't. That whatever policies that politicians think are going to get them elected back to power, it's not as if politicians don't know how to work the system. They do know how to work the system. When they have to get their party coffers filled for the coming elections, they all know how to do it. So even if they have to make money on the contracts, that does require some amount of thought, some amount of analysis, understanding the policies, understanding the loopholes required to know, okay, where is it that I'm going to be able to have the most amount of rent-seeking behavior, and where is it that the most amount of money can be made? Because right now the incentive is basically that we have to get re-elected. और कैसे होगा re-election? उसके लिए पैसे चाहिए. क्यों चाहिए उसके लिए पैसे? Because that is the most effective form of getting re-elected. Why? Because either you have some kind of populist policies, or there is direct distribution of money, or there is distribution of liquor, saris, TVs. I mean, we have seen the whole range of things. So right now, why is a politician busy spending their 5 years in governance, filling their pockets, their party coffers, etc., apart from the fact that Indian politicians think कि एक बारी जीत गए तो 7 पीढ़ी के लिए हम देख लेंगे. It is basically because they want to get re-elected, and that is what they think is the primary way in which they are going to get re-elected, if they have enough money to contest the next election. And I think that this is really, if we are looking to answer this question of what is going to bring gender-sensitive governance, is to understand that this is the only lever that is ever going to move politicians. We can sit here endlessly discuss whether it impacts GDP, whether it does not impact GDP, whether it leads to economic growth, whether it improves maternal mortality or reduces the rate. The only thing that is ever going to make a difference to a party or a politician is that they think that bringing in X policy, be it in education, be it in healthcare, be it in women's education, be it in their basic rights, sanitation, etc., is actually going to bring them electoral benefits. And I think therefore we as people who are interested, who want that there needs to be gender sensitive governance, and who feel that these disparities need to go away, I think sometimes many of us, we end up working on the wrong side of the picture. I mean, I think we sometimes need to turn our interventions on their head, because we are often, either as policy makers, as people working in non-profits, etc., looking towards the supply side, that what could be a good policy measure? What could be a way in which women have access to better sanitation? What could be a way in which women have access to better healthcare? So we are really looking at the supply side. And then we are looking to politicians, looking to governments to implement those measures. I think what we really need to be working on is to create the demand side. Because it is finally that demand side that when women, who constitute 50% of the voting population, when we can create that demand side, that women as voters, that their voting, their democratic right, depends on the ability to provide them high quality governance, providing them schools, providing them higher education, providing them safety and security, providing them access to proper health care. It is only when that happens that I personally believe anything is going to move. That if any politician, who I believe will always be motivated only and only by a desire to get re-elected, if they know the fact that when I go back for re-election 5 years later, the women in my constituency are not going to vote for me unless I have improved schools, unless I have provided better sanitation, unless I have provided better health care. Till there is this fear of God in them, however much we may provide inputs on supply side, I can assure you nothing is going to change. Because that is how the cycle will keep moving. Any politician will just keep getting pushed towards that form of policy making or governance that is going to get them re-elected. So I think for those of us who are really moved by this question and who feel that some intervention is needed, I think we need to re-look at what we are doing. And rather than providing governments with thoughts, with ideas, because one thing that 4 years of I've been working with the Delhi government, working in governance, has shown me is that policy making is no great rocket science at the end of the day, that it's often the biggest challenge is of implementation. And I think that that is something that is the far easier side of the picture to figure out. That I think that we as people who are concerned and care enough about having gender sensitive governance really need to go out there and actually make women into like a voting bloc, to bring them out of their homes and have them organized as voters who can demand certain rights. To bring them out and get them to say that we are only going to vote for a politician if they provide us with proper health care. And so a politician knows कि भाई अगर मैंने dispensary ठीक नहीं की या वहाँ पे आंगनवाड़ी नहीं चल रही है तो फिर मुझे अपने MLA के election में vote नहीं मिलने वाला है इस गांव से. That is when real change is going to happen. And I think that in many ways is food for thought for all of us. That if we want to bring about this change, then going to governments is not enough. And I would even say that while it is essential to have women politicians, of course, just by the fact that, I mean, even this data shows to us that it is far more likely that those who have certain life experiences are likely to be more sensitive to those forms of governance. But I would even argue that it's not enough just to have women legislators, because there exist far too many power structures within political parties, within how governments work, that women legislators are also not able to have the kind of impact that we think they do. So in democracy, I think that just as in the market, the consumer is king, finally in the market, in a democracy, it is really the voter who decides. And so far, voters have shown that आप हमें पैसा दे दो, आप हमें साड़ी दे दो, आप हमें टीवी दे दो, तो हम आपको वोट दे देंगे. तो वही होता है. Politicians gather themselves in those 5 years के पैसा, साड़ी, टीवी, दारू, they are gathering their resources for that. But the day that voters begin to say कि हमें स्कूल दे दो, हमें अस्पताल दे दो, हमें डिस्पेंसरी दे दो, हमें आंगनवाड़ी दे दो, that is the day when the choices that politicians make are going to change, and that is the day when we are actually going to have gender-sensitive governance. Thank you.
Now request Dr. Mudit Kapoor to make his presentation.
Good evening. Thank you very much. It's only going to get worse. I mean, we had Sonia presenting her data, empirical work. Atishi is a great orator. She has a lot of experience in public life. And I'm sorry I'm subjecting you to, slides. I promise you it won't be more than 2. But this is a very, very interesting and a very different occasion for me. I attended a security seminar, I believe 3 weeks ago in Brookings. And there was not a single female in that seminar, or maybe there were a few. Now I'm attending a gender seminar, and of course it's about women, but I think we should have seen a large participation of men, and unfortunately that's not happened. I see a lot of women, and women are familiar with these issues. And this to me depicts actually the philosophical issue which is the complete subjugation of women. It's very complete because, unlike slavery, where it was very explicit form of white dominating over black, over here the subjugation is complete because there is such a subtle domination which has persisted for such a long period of time that unfortunately it's a very challenging task. I mean, we've had a civil war to get rid of black and white, the issue of slavery, after that the civil rights movement. But if you look at the subjugation of women, which is continued, which is not a very modern phenomenon, it has existed for a very long period of time. But unfortunately, we've had no sort of movement to rid us of this yoke to a certain extent. So let me sort of, just in the interest of time, I looked at the history of, Enlightenment movement when we started discussing about men's rights, equality, fraternity, pursuit of happiness. what were people talking about women? I mean, at that point in time, I thought the discussions would have been much more general. You know, I mean, what were the philosophical discussions? And then I came across interesting, quotes by philosophers. So when it came to on the education of girls, this is the time when these discussions were beginning to happen. This is the start of the Enlightenment period. And the learning of girls should be kept with narrow bounds. It is important to restrain their minds as much as possible, keeping them focused on their domestic duties, that is managing household, making a husband happy, and raising children. I remind my wife very often that what your role is. Philosophically what your role is. She doesn't agree with me. And it is explicitly be withheld from women, it might turn their heads. So you see, the subjugation, when you have great philosophers who are talking about rights of men, but these are also philosophers who are talking about what women should have. So you see, the Enlightenment movement was never aimed at women. In fact, philosophers were justifying the subjugation of women. And in fact, they felt that that would disrupt society in some way. Explicitly women must be withheld. So explicit withheld means that if some woman does tries to break loose, then she has to be held up. It's not allowed. And all the economists who are sitting here, and if they could hazard a guess who might have said this, it would be remarkable. The girls are taught what was useful them for to know and nothing else. Every element of their education should prepare them for their predestined domestic roles, either to improve their natural attractions of the person or to form their mind to reserve to modesty, chastity, and to economy, to render them both likely to become mistresses of a family, to behave properly when they become such. This is, coming from our father of economics, Adam Smith, who was supposed to be one of the great liberal thinkers. He's the father of, I'm an economist. He's the most cited economist. But when it comes to women, even a great liberal thinker at that point in time is Scott. And nobody contests these thoughts. You see, these thoughts are not because leaders are imposing it. They're being imposed in the household. I have several nephews and nieces. In a very subtle way, I'm subjecting them to what they should do and what they should not do. And I think women's participation is largely about that, because so far, then I looked historically, has there ever been a war fought for women's rights? After all, if they are being subjected to all sorts of subjugation, is there any evidence of a war being fought? We've seen war being fought for opium, we've seen war being fought for men's rights, for freedom. But what about women's rights? 50, if not 50% of the population. The only time I came close to reference of a war that was fought for women's rights, or at least one of the reasons for women's rights, was Afghan war. When George Bush wanted to attack Afghanistan, it was at that point in time one of the persuasive arguments he was making to the population was that women's rights in Afghanistan are not in the right direction, and US has the human right to intervene. So you see, unfortunately, that war, if you look at now the statistics from that war, how many women and children were killed when the mother of all bombs was dropped by the US, then unfortunately bombs don't discriminate. They have a tendency, and typically the weakest section of the society suffers the most. So my argument, I'm not trying to contest over here whether women's rights or women's participation is good for the economy, is good for maternal mortality. I think these are important studies. But I think what's important to recognize is that sometimes some rights are required as an end in itself. It doesn't matter. If, for example, suppose I show a statistical study, I bring out a statistical study, and there are several of them which shows that women's reservations have no impact on economic outcome. Or there are some studies I've also seen which have shown that there's an adverse impact on economic outcome. Then what do we do with those scientific studies? If suppose women have had no experience whatsoever in corporate boards, which is what the study shows, but they're not able to verify it, and due to which their performance is affected. So now how do we take these studies? How do we take the general message? I think that's a bigger question, in my opinion, than trying to put the burden of proof on the women that, look, you are good, that's why you deserve it. No, the question of right is not about whether you're good or whether you're bad. It's a question about human rights. Does a woman have rights, period? And I think that's a larger question, but unfortunately these questions are addressed in an audience where by and large the people who are subjected are in the audience, and the people who in a subtle way are subjugating are sort of missing in the audience, which I don't understand why they don't want to be a part, but I do get the hint. I mean, the hint is right here. I mean, this is my thought. I'm still living in the world of 18th century, where by and large, I am driven by such liberal ideas. I've never challenged them at home, and I don't, somehow or the other, I'm too lazy to challenge them. And that's why I feel that the subjugation of women is absolutely complete, because the worst form of slavery is not when I explicitly dominate over you, but when I manipulate your mind so that you do exactly what I want you to do. And I think that manipulation is complete. There is some movements toward it, but let me assure you, we've not seen a radical movement to transform this. I mean, whether we look at the developed countries, we very often convince ourselves that the outcomes for women have improved. Yes, it is true. But when it comes to basic rights, when it comes to subjugation, when it comes to various gender violence, there is huge discrimination, even in the developed parts of the country. When you look at certain statistics on whether it is rape, the Me Too movement, it comes out in a very subtle form. It's not as obvious, as explicit it used to be in the past, but I think it does come out in very subtle form. And today, when you look at even the developed country, even countries like the US, I mean, where we are talking about women's rise in the parliament, you know, more people coming to the Senate, I don't think life is being made very easy for them. I don't think they're being welcomed by certain dispensation who feel that they perhaps are not the right people to be there. You know, it's a man's job. I mean, what are these people doing out there? So in a very sort of implicit manner, it explodes itself. So I think the revolution has not happened. We are seeing some improvement, but I must admit that the movement, in my opinion, when it came to other forms of slavery, the movements which happened were much quicker, much more expedient, but this movement is more subtle, it's much slower, and I think that's what I have to say about women's participation in economic development. Thank you.
Thank you, Mudit. Well, just to sort of bring this to a conclusion, we will have one round of Q&A. But we do have a paper called The Silent Revolution. Mudit, you and I co-authored it. And part of it is telling you, this is based on the demand side story that Atishi brought out. It tells us that without any top-down intervention, any institutional prioritizing, women voters in India are voting. We call it a silent revolution for a reason, but it's also self-empowerment. It's really not a policy intervention of any sort. And across every state, over the years, across elections, you are seeing greater women participation. In fact, we wrote a subsequent paper which said that the growth in women voters is also impacting performance of leaders, meaning the probability of re-election, Atishi. So I think there is hope. And I think it is happening the right way. It is, of course, very slow. Is it sufficient? No. It will require a lot more intervention. To those of you who might have forgotten, the Women's Reservation Bill, of course, it's expired, but it was tabled under Deve Gowda. We don't give enough credit to sometimes leaders who have thought of progressive radical movements. It is never a bad time to discuss about women's reservation, because not that women's reservation will solve the problem, because eventually you'll have 5 women that have to win an election, and winning election therefore goes back to everything that she mentioned. So even the women are going to woo the average voter, who tend to be male in many parts of the country. So there are fundamental market breakdowns in the electoral democratic system itself. So there is research, there's evidence coming about which gives us cause for hope. So we will take one round of question because we only have 10 minutes. If you could pass the mic around, please. Yeah, if we could start from the lady at the back, yeah.
Professor Bhalotra, thank you very much for your presentation. I just have queries, but, and I've not followed the specific stream of your research, so it could just be that it's already covered in your written paper. But do you actually look at urban-rural differences? And especially the road scheme you mentioned was, I think, as far as my understanding goes, is rural, and it's and also, do you also do more nuanced analysis with sub-Saharan Africa, where there are quotas at multiple levels? Like ma'am mentioned that, you know, India doesn't have quotas at the parliamentary level, whereas sub-Saharan Africa countries there have advanced far ahead of us in terms of quotas and the kind of impacts that they could be possibly having on health and demographic indicators. Thank you very much.
So Sonia, can we just gather a few questions and then you can address them maybe 3 at a time? Yes,
Hi,
Namita.
my question is to Atishi. You know, we know that women have been out voting. More women voters have been turning up to vote than men in many states, not just in this last election, but even going back to the previous election. So do women vote as a bloc? We tend to also assume that women will want to vote for developmental issues, for maternal mortality, for schools and for education. And pardon me if this seems personal, but how would you then account for your defeat or the electoral victory of somebody like Sadhvi Pragya?
Can we get, yeah.
I am Bidut Mohanty. You know that, first of all, I will ask Ravi, I have a small question for you. But, you know, if we think that particularly rural women, because I have been working on women in panchayats for last 25 years. So, if you think that women are empowered because of 50% reservation, in some cases they are, you know, the best index of being empowered is the survival of girl child. If it is not happening, then I think we need to go, you know, travel many more miles before we get empowered. Thank you. To Rob, you know, I am an economist also. Adam Smith worked in 18th century, and the issues were very different. But what about Norway? You know, Nordic countries. What are the situations? Do you think women have achieved some empowerment? Thank you.
Thank you. So we can start with each of, to Namita's, okay?
So it's sort of related, and it's what I was trying to put this to any three. I mean, the issue she raised is also the question of ideology. Do women politicians or women in politics always, you know, they respond only to development challenges, but even that can be an ideological response. There can be market liberals among women, there will be leftists among women whose whole approach to addressing issues will be quite different. Also about the role of women in society, you know, a leftist woman and an extreme like a Sadhvi Pragya versus a Brinda Karat. The whole approach to that will be different. So I was wondering how that would play out.
Okay, maybe we can start with you, Sonia, and then we'll have Atishi and Mudit respond.
So, in his study, we didn't distinguish rural and urban constituencies. We cannot. You're right that the analysis of the road scheme is implicitly rural because it's a village road scheme. So we didn't select the villages, we selected the right.
So, no? Can you say something?
Yeah. Is that better?
You're fine. You're fine. Yeah.
Okay. And regarding the quotas at different levels, it's true that sub-Saharan Africa is ahead of the game, better than Europe in many countries. The data we use, because one has to make a choice between the scope, like the scale of the study, and the detail, it's just women in parliament. And so I think it is really interesting to look at the levels and which level is more effective, but that would need to be a country-specific analysis, which we haven't done.
Atishi.
Hello. Yeah. So the thing is that while women may be outvoting men, the question is what issues are they voting on? And I don't think that there is anything to tell us so far that women are actually voting on developmental issues. When I was contesting elections and we were having, like, there's a discussion on how do you meet women voters. And I was told that the best way is to meet Mandir ki Bhajan Mandali. And that is where the greatest aggregation of women actually happens. And so it is, this is what we need to understand, that what is really at this point of time shaping the worldview of the women voters. And it is our assumption that they are going to be voting on developmental indicators. But nothing in my experience so far, and as I said, data of someone else would have to respond on, nothing in my experience tells me that that is the basis of their voting. And that is really somewhere where I think our role as people who have looked at some of these issues, might have worked on some developmental indicators, might be working in the non-profit sector, that is really where our role comes into play. And if this is where we want to intervene in terms of improving these indicators, see, women are 50% of the voters. And so if women do decide to vote on a certain issue, I mean, you see different interest groups holding governments to ransom. Jats say that we want reservation, and the one entire state comes to a standstill, and legislation has to happen on that. So you have different interest groups, which are much smaller interest groups, which can hold the government to ransom. So women, if they do organize and do come to demand certain policy decisions, certain financial allocations, access to education, access to healthcare, do have an ability to influence policy and influence governance. But I think the important thing to realize is, where is that lever of change? And that lever of change, as I said even earlier, has to be on the demand side. Because finally, that is the lever of change that is going to affect the politician, male or female. And yes, of course, intrinsic motivation is going to be different for a woman politician just coming out of life experience. That out of life experience, what are the concerns on maternal mortality, what are the concerns even on child care, etc., is something that a woman politician is likely to know much better. But as I said, it's finally that strategic consideration that is going to have an impact. And I wanted to respond to one thing that Mudit said about the absence of men, and that's a fact. But I think if you look at any right that any group across the world has got, it has never been given by the oppressor to the oppressed. It has been fought for, struggled for, and that is when anyone who has been oppressed, either in an explicit or a subtle manner. So, and I think that this subjugation is a fact that we all have to accept. Sometimes, like often on television debates, or a lot of people ask this question, okay, your party should give more tickets to women. Like this is, I think that what we have to realize is that if we do want to make a difference in this world, we should throw this word should out of the dictionary. Because it means nothing. I mean, we have to accept the reality where it is, where the word stands, and that is where we need to move from. The reality is that it's an unequal world for women. The reality is that, let alone politics, women find it difficult to participate in the workforce. I have so many friends and colleagues who studied with me in some of the premier national and international educational institutions who have to make difficult career choices because they are women, who plan their lives in such a way that if I have a child at X age, then I will not become a partner in my law firm. Therefore, I have to wait till I cross this age, become a partner in my law firm or the investment bank that I work in, and then I can take 1 or 2 years off so that I can have my child and still not lose my career promotions. So politics is a very different ball game altogether. It is far more difficult as a choice, as a life, as a profession, than an investment bank or a law firm. And so women find it difficult to participate in what is a far more sanitized working environment because it is an unequal world. But I think that is the starting point that we have to accept. And that is where the struggle really has to begin from. Until we accept that this inequality exists, and we have to find what is a lever of change to actually be able to change that. So, which is why I actually strongly feel that this word should be thrown out of the dictionary. And as I actually think that no one else is going to struggle for women's rights. Women are going to have to do it themselves. I would urge many of you that I think that finally a lot of decisions, be it on policy, be it on governance, are finally taken by politicians. And until women themselves are willing to take this difficult plunge into politics, not necessarily as politicians, maybe as politicians, but also those who are influencing this decision. Until that happens, we can talk as much as we want, but things are not going to change on the ground, either in terms of women's representation or in terms of governance that is more sensitive to women.
Thank you. Mudit?
So, let me give you, the reason I put up Adam Smith out there was not because it's applicable to 18th century, but if you were to read that quote, if I didn't put it up in 18th century, it would resonate with many households today. That was the point. I mean, but the point is that Adam Smith, who otherwise was one of the greatest liberal thinkers, this is what he writes in The Wealth of Nations, which is not told to many of my students. I'll talk about Invisible Hand, for example, which is just mentioned once in the text. But it has become a mantra in terms of what we should do vis-a-vis government, institutional arrangements. It becomes the starting point for all the work that we subsequently do. So I wanted to bring this out, that this subjugation of women is far more complete than any other subjugation we've had in the past. Whether it is black and white, black versus white, or whether it is in the form of one country, the colonization of other countries. There were lots of discussion on these issues, but when it comes to the subjugation of women, it's remained in the background. And I agree with you, Atishi, that it's a struggle. Whenever women have got rights, they've not got it because of the benevolence of the oppressor. I mean, if you have more women participating in the labor force in Vietnam, it's not because in Vietnam women were liberated, it happened because of the Vietnam War. If women participated more in the labor force, it happened due to World War II. There were certain scientific achievements which happened which had nothing to do with women, which sort of allowed women to participate. So, and then you talked about Nordic countries. Yes, when we compare Nordic countries to developing countries, we see there is more equality for women in Nordic countries. But when you look at the data on sexual harassment or the number of rapes, and just compare the data with what you would call a developed country and see disproportionately who is being sexually harassed. At least we should find both male and female should be sexually harassed. If it is a part of human nature for some people to sexually harass them, but why is it dominating predominantly among women? So is it okay for us to satisfy ourselves, oh, it is far less than what's happening in other countries? No, it's not true. You look at the sexual harassment which happened in Denmark, which became a national case, which was in one of the most famous artistic studio called Zentropa, which has sort of produced movies which are world-class movies. And then suddenly you hear stories about sexual harassment which is unprecedented for, and many of those stories don't come because these are countries which do very well. But my question is, what does it mean by very well? Are we very happy that the sexual harassment cases are far less than India? So now we should be very happy. Why should it happen? I mean, why not in equal proportion? I'm saying if it has to happen, let it happen in equal proportion. Why should there be discrimination in that? I mean, if women are being raped, let men be raped too. What prevents that? But the question is when it's disproportionate to a particular gender within a country, then I believe the process of development is slow from their perspective, from what they've achieved. So that was the point.
Okay.
But lower numbers also means lower reporting.
Where?
Does it necessarily mean that there are fewer rapes happening? We don't know.
Where?
One, in India or in developing countries, because one, we have no NCRT data since 2016, and two is we don't know how many are actually coming forward to report.
So that's what I'm saying. I'm not comparing India to Nordic countries. I'm just asking that in Nordic countries at the level of development, why are most rapes aimed at women? Why can't men be raped by women too? I mean, why at all there are rapes out there? Why is there sexual harassment out there? Why is it that women in Nordic countries have to still get a right to be on the board? I mean, why do we need reservations where they are fighting for those? This tells you that something is also not right in their society. Maybe relatively they are better than us, but doesn't mean that it's all right in their society. So that was the point I was trying to make, that Enlightenment philosophers, the people who have given us constitution and natural concept of natural rights, never had women in their mind. That's all I'm trying to tell you. And the constitution that we swear by today is also written by inspiration from those philosophers who always thought the way it was being presented about women. So if you have to fight for the question, that's why I say it is complete, because even though it involves significant number of women, there has never been a violent, or you might call it silent, but a revolutionary overthrow of that mindset. That has not yet happened. We've had several other ideas, but not in this space. That's the point.
So let me wrap up again on a positive note.
Can I ask one question?
You want to ask a question? Yes, of
Yes.
course.
I'm very keen to ask Atishi. You say that women are voting, but they're not voting by development indicators.
That's
so
what
do-
my experience shows.
So I'm wondering, what do you think on the ground is the potential to change that through, for example, a soap opera on TV in which, in this playing of the soap opera, it's clear that A, women care about certain development indicators, and B, that if they care, they can make it happen through their votes. Or otherwise just information campaigns, posters.
No, I definitely think it can change. The reason it can change is that I'd share an experience with you that one of the things that a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past 4 years has been in the education sector. And one of our major intervention has been getting a lot of community participation through school management committees. And as per the Right to Education Act, 50% members in school management committees have to be women. So a lot of parents, a lot of women, mothers participate in school management committees. And because we have spent the last 4 years working a lot on this participation, making them aware of what they can do as management committee members, ensuring that schools actually have to hear them out, respond to what they have to say. Today, a lot of this group of mothers who might not ever have stepped out of their homes have a very different level of empowerment. They have a very different level of understanding. And so all of these women, if you were to speak to them and ask them, they would all tell you, हम ऐसी पार्टी को वोट देंगे जो स्कूल ठीक करेगी. Because they have been through that experience of, and not only would they do it themselves, they'd probably go to 20 of their neighbors and also tell them, because now they see the link between their participation and the impact it has on their children's lives. And seeing that link is important. And if you were to see, women are generally far less politically aware. Their access to information is much lower, and it's a vicious circle because they have lower literacy rates. Therefore, their access to news and newspapers is lesser. Therefore, their influence on voting is lesser, and whoever wins ends up sort of perpetuating this cycle. So I think this link, this vicious cycle has to be broken at the point at which women are making their demand. And I think that if this linkage can be created in the mind of their voter, that what is the, right now, let alone women, most voters in India don't make the linkage between the dismal state of affairs in their lives, their education, sanitation, healthcare, unemployment, and that the vote that they cast once every 5 years. I used to live in rural Madhya Pradesh for many years, and we had a panchayat election. And so I was asking some of the people in the village that, whom are you going to vote for? Just before, when we were lining up to vote in that election. So one of them said to me, then she named the existing sarpanch and said कि हम तो इसको वोट देंगे. तो मैंने पूछा क्यों? I said we all know the fact that he's been useless. He eats all the NREGA money, nothing happens, and still you're going to vote for him. She said नहीं वो जीतने वाला है ना election. Another instance, I had again from rural Madhya Pradesh, another area on the Madhya Pradesh-Chhattisgarh border, and again there was a husband-wife who were going to cast their vote. So I asked them कि किसको vote दोगे? And they named a particular party and they named a candidate. So मैंने पूछा क्यों? उन्होंने हमें पैसे दिए हैं. तो मैंने कहा भाई पैसे तो आपको मिल गए हैं. How will they ever know whom you voted for? They said नहीं ठीक नहीं लगता ना. अब उनके पैसे ले लिए हैं तो उनको वोट दे ही देना चाहिए. Or, which is a very common answer if you were to ask people कि ये कैंडिडेट ब्राह्मण है, ये कैंडिडेट हमारी कास्ट का है, और why is it that all parties look at a social demography and think जी यहाँ से हम पूर्वांचली कैंडिडेट देंगे, यहाँ से हम उत्तराखंड का कैंडिडेट देंगे, यहाँ से हम पंजाबी ब्राह्मण देंगे. because that is what is the voting consideration for a voter. And it's not as if that they are not affected by unemployment. It's not as if they are not affected by expensive school fees. It's not as if they are not affected by the fact that there is like dirt, like in Delhi there is just dirt all around. Whether this is, it's not, but this linkage is not clear, that the vote that I go to cast, look at the direct impact it has in my life. And the woman voter, no voter is really seeing that linkage.
But it puzzles me that political competition isn't making it happen, because the politician who wants to win through supplying sanitation or whatever should talk loudly about it, and then people will learn.
We are trying to get elected on the issue of education, and I think this is an interesting experiment.
Yeah.
I think that for me it's an interesting experiment. Delhi elections come up in February of 2020.
Yeah.
And Aam Aadmi Party has put its neck out and said that we are looking to be re-elected on the agenda of improving education and healthcare. And that we have spent the past 5 years improving education, healthcare, access to electricity, water, etc. That is basic governance issues. I personally think that the result of this election is really going to impact the direction in which politics in this country will move. If Aam Aadmi Party was to win this election after putting their neck out and saying that this is our product that we are selling on the market, are people willing to buy it? If Aam Aadmi Party wins after saying that this is what you vote for us, then I think the reason why there is because no one is providing this product. Everyone, it's a competition between kambal and sari and alcohol and a caste combination. This is really what are the competing products on this market. So if, for example, one company was to get up and say, "Ji, hamare paas alag product hai," and in this election, I believe that Aam Aadmi Party is standing up and saying that we have a different product, we have a proven governance track record and all of these things. Vote for us because of this. If we were to win this election, then I feel that this would have an impact potentially on the behavior of many other political parties. But so would the reverse. If we were not to win, I can guarantee you that then no other political party, at least for the next decade or so, would be willing to stick their neck out and say कि हमें स्कूल ठीक करने हैं, हमें अस्पताल ठीक करने हैं, हमें आंगनबाड़ी ठीक करनी है, हमें लोगों तक बिजली पानी पहुंचानी है, because only like there's no political dividends.
So there is actually, Atishi, let me tell you a story. In 2005, without providing an alternative, in 2005 in February there was an election in Bihar. And there was no party that won the election. So in October there was re-election. And in that re-election, Nitish Kumar came to power with majority. Now nothing happened in between because in 6 months there was no proven track record, nothing. It was a president's rule. But you know what explained the fact that in 36% of the constituencies the election results changed, they turned, meaning in what they voted in February and in October were for two different parties. The only thing that explains it is women voters coming out and voting in larger number. In fact, it's a very cool paper, I recommend all of you read it, because what you see is when more women came out and voted, the probability of re-election, if more men came out and voted, no change. When more women came out and voted, the probability of re-election went down drastically. So women came out and defeated Lalu Yadav's RJD after 15 years of complete jungle raj. You should read the history of Bihar. And Nitish, and this is where you have to give politicians there, they have their ears on the ground. We try to learn numbers and we try to, these are all, afterthoughts. Nitish Kumar's policy till date, to a fault, I think sometimes, is gender. He's been focusing, in fact, first 1 year and subsequently, it's all been about cycle scheme, the pension scheme, it's been about girls' hostel, it's all gender, right? Now, and also the fact is, we have to realize that change is happening. We are trying to also document and understand some of that change, and politicians are responding to that change, and which is a good thing. But quotas are not just in terms of the quota that we understand. The African National Congress gives us a very successful example of an alternate quota system, right? Which is, and someone mentioned Brinda Karat and Pragya Sadhvi Pragya, I'd like to tell you that Brinda Karat is part of a party of 10 Politburo members. Guess how many women? It's supposed to be a progressive party. 1. And she had Well, now too. Sadhvi Pragya happens to be from a party which has 27%. So now what is progressive? Number one, every party, political party in this country has a constitution. Can we at least the, not just in terms of voters, but people who read and write and who care about these issues, hold these political parties to their own constitution? Why should women be heading Mahila Morcha alone and nothing else? So these are, I mean, you have to think about bringing about quotas in different forms. There is also quotas for not just seats in parliament, but candidatures. Because why are 70% of women candidates fighting as independents? It's very costly. Why can't political parties be mandated? So we can think in many ways of bringing equal opportunity. Beyond that, of course, its outcome we don't know. But we can think of refreshing ways in which, you know, affirmative action, lowering the cost of entry into politics can seriously be thought through for women, and hopefully then many good things will happen, including maternal mortality, access to care, and so on. And so on.
But I would like to argue one point here. I think that,
and of course, we are 20 minutes way past, but who cares?
but I think which is why I think this distinction we need to understand between intrinsic motivation and strategic motivation, because I think that yes, it is good to think about intrinsic motivation, but finally I think we need to understand what it is that moves the system. This is not to say that women did not vote in a certain way in Bihar. This is not to say that different politicians have not had gender sensitive policies, etc. But I think that what we need to understand is that if on a the point that I was trying to make is if we want change on a larger scale, in a democracy, the greatest lever of change is the demand of the voter.
Absolutely.
And I think that that is where we can eventually have greatest impact on policy.
Yeah.
Because if we can create that demand, because I think that is what is our role as citizens? So I would ask, what is our role? For many people who are sitting in the room, many women who are sitting in the room, we are all extremely privileged. We have probably come from economically well-off homes. We have had education in high quality institutions. We have a financially secure. So what is our responsibility in this? So we probably don't have to pay the price for, we have private solutions to many public problems that exist for women. But the fact is, what is our responsibility as citizens or privileged members of a certain community is that you have to make sure that the system works for everyone. And where is it that we could make our most effective intervention is, I think, in raising awareness and organizing women as voters demanding their rights.
Absolutely. Who could disagree with that? It's fantastic. On that note, thank you all. We have coffee and sandwiches at the back. Thank you very much.